Okay, great. Now, together with Sasha Fink and Jennifer Wind, I'm editor-in-chief of Philosophy in the Mind Sciences, or PhiMySci for short, an open access journal. And we recently published a special issue on the neural correlates of consciousness. So actually, last year there was a double anniversary with respect to the neural correlates of consciousness. So 30 years ago, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch published a seminal paper towards the neurobiological theory of consciousness, in which they put the search for the neural correlates of consciousness on the scientific agenda. And then 10 years later, 20 years ago, a seminal paper by David Chalmers appeared in a collection edited by Thomas Metzinger. And in that paper, Chalmers tried to define the notion of an NCC in a way that captured the way researchers themselves were using the concept. And it is at least widely regarded as a standard definition of an NCC, but there's still a lot of discussion both about the concept of an NCC and about how to empirically do research on the neural correlates of consciousness. So that's why we have this special issue. And actually we have two parts. The first part was published last year and the second part will follow this year. And so as Sasha points out in his editorial introduction, there's been a lot of impact on the science of consciousness by research on NCCs, and there are also many controversies. So a lot of debate and about this, and still many things that have to be investigated. So I just highlight 4 papers from this special issue. For instance, we have a paper by Colin Klein, Jakob Howie, and Tim Bain, in which they suggest that actually we should move from talking about the NCCs to the difference makers of consciousness, and thereby achieve more of an explanation than is afforded by NCCs alone. Then there's a discussion about the notion of a global state of consciousness. So as you may know, there are NCCs of global states of consciousness and of local states or contents of consciousness. And this is a distinction David Chalmers already hinted at in his seminal paper, but there's some discussion about what exactly a global state of consciousness is. And we have 2 papers that address this question. And then there's a paper by Jakob Howie and Anil Seth, who argue that predictive processing can serve as a systematic basis for identifying the neural correlates of consciousness. And I mean, this was, of course, an advertisement for the journal, but also I think this serves to highlight that there's a lot of interesting research and much progress in the science of consciousness. But the example of an NCC illustrates that there's also still a lot of debate and many things we don't know. So in fact, I think it's fair to say that we currently have great data, many theories in the science of consciousness, but also many controversies and little consensus on even fundamental questions. I mean, just think about the neural correlates of consciousness, and there's not even a consensus on what the best way is to study the neural correlates of consciousness, or whether it's actually whether we should study the neural correlates or maybe something different like the difference makers or explanatory correlates of consciousness or computational correlates and so on. So this all suggests that actually we are still far from a mature science of consciousness, because in a mature science, it is clear what the fundamental problems and questions are and how to address them. And since there's so much debate on fundamental issues, the science of consciousness has yet to mature. And another example of this can be found in just the fact that there are so many different theories of consciousness. And in fact, I will focus on this problem in this talk, and we'll ask how can theoretical approaches advance the science of consciousness, and more specifically, how can we make progress on theories of consciousness? So I will discuss 3 different strategies. The first I call assess and adapt, and this basically involves specifying criteria for assessing theories of consciousness, and then you can compare these theories with respect to these criteria and potentially improve existing theories or build new theories. A third strategy is what I call integration, which involves combining different theories. The idea would be that there are many good theories, but if we put them together, they're even better. And the third strategy I will discuss is what I call unification, which involves replacing, or at least in the long run, replacing existing theories with something simpler, namely models that only capture necessary conditions for consciousness. And this could then lead to another form of progress, in that these assumptions would capture some common ground between different theories without just combining them in the sense of integration. Okay, I will further explain and illustrate these strategies in what follows, and I will claim that theoretical approaches should focus on unification. And by this, I don't mean that assess and adapt and integration don't work. I would just suggest that unification is particularly promising when it comes to theoretical work on consciousness. Okay, so here's a list of theories of consciousness, and this list may seem relatively long, but of course there are many more theories of consciousness that have been proposed. So basically, if we want to find out what consciousness is and how it can be explained, we have a long list of theories from which we can choose, and it's not clear how we can make any progress on this because they can't all be right. Some of them must be false, and so we have these many theories, and yeah, one suggestion would be to take a closer look at the theories and then say, okay, some of these theories have some empirical support, others are more speculative, and some are really sophisticated and have been developed over a long time. Others are just relatively sketchy and just some ideas that are maybe not that promising. So based on such considerations, we could perhaps eliminate some of these proposals, but still there will remain many theories of consciousness, and the basic problem remains: how can we make progress on this? How can we decide which of these theories, if any, is the true theory of consciousness, or which are the best, most promising theories? And another response one could make is to say, look, there are different types of consciousness, and some of these theories may only address one type of consciousness. So we can, if we're interested in a particular type of consciousness, we can disregard all theories of consciousness that do not address this type of consciousness. So what I have in mind here is, first of all, a distinction between what one could call consciousness as such, or pure awareness, and a structured consciousness. So a consciousness as such has been called is also called minimal phenomenal experience. That's a term coined by Jennifer Wind, and more recently Thomas Metzinger has characterized this as atemporal, selfless experience that's not tied to an individual first-person perspective, and it's characterized by the absence of spatial, temporal, or subject-object relations. And such types of conscious experiences, consciousness as such, or pure awareness, is present in certain meditative states, or during states induced by psychedelics, or can be present in dreamless sleep and in other states. And there's actually a large body of literature on pure awareness or minimal phenomenal experience, mainly from Eastern traditions. And this is becoming a topic of interest also in the Western tradition now. Okay, and we can distinguish this type of experience from what one could call structured consciousness. And structured consciousness is characterized by spatial, temporal, and subject-object relations. So I would assume that this is what you and I are drawing right now. We are experiencing different things. We experience spatial relations between them, maybe also part-whole relations. And I experience myself as talking right now, as perceiving different things. So there's clear subject-object structure to my conscious experience. Okay, so this would be a distinction one could make, and then another distinction between global and local states of consciousness. And examples of global states would be alert wakefulness, dreaming, dreamless sleep, coma, and so on. And local states would be distinguished with respect to their contents, for example, seeing a red apple versus smelling a rose or feeling pain. And now, if we look at theories of consciousness again, then we can we see that most theories of consciousness are actually theories of global states of structured consciousness. So even making this distinction between different types of consciousness does not really help if we want to eliminate some theories of consciousness, because if we're interested in structured states of consciousness, global states of structured consciousness, then actually most of the theories that have been proposed are relevant, because this is what most of them target. So we have to find another way of maybe comparing or eliminating some theories. And as I already mentioned, I will now discuss 3 different strategies. I will give some examples for the first and the second strategy, and then I will focus on unification, because and will argue that this is most promising. So here's a recent paper on comparing theories of consciousness, and the authors propose a list of criteria with which can be used to compare theories. So here on the left there are the criteria, 9 criteria, and then there on the right, on the top of the table, there are different theories of consciousness, and they are all evaluated with respect to these criteria. And I just want to draw your attention to these 2 criteria. It copes with the small network argument, it copes with the multiple realization argument. I will explain in a moment what these mean. And as you can see here, these 2 criteria almost partition the set of theories into 2 classes. So there's one class of theories that copes with one of these arguments, but not with the other, and another class that does not cope with the first argument, but does cope with the other argument. And so I start with the multiple realization argument. This just says, well, a theory of consciousness should also account for consciousness in non-human systems. So the non-human animals are conscious, at least some of them, and the theory of consciousness should be applicable to the non-human case, and maybe ideally tell us whether some controversial cases, whether animals that are relatively different from human beings, whether they are conscious or not. And there are some theories that can in principle be applied to the non-human case, and others that focus more on what's going on in the human brain, and so they're more difficult to apply to the non-human case. And the small network argument says that, well, if you says that a simple system should not fulfill sufficient conditions for consciousness. So some theories of consciousness are relatively liberal. They provide criteria that can also be satisfied by very, very simple systems, by small networks. And it's very implausible that such simple systems are conscious. So if a theory of consciousness would say, well, these simple systems are conscious, then there seems to be a problem. And in fact, these two criteria are particularly interesting because there seems to be kind of a dilemma, not a real logical dilemma, but a tension between these criteria. Because if a theory is liberal enough as to be applicable to the non-human case, then it seems it can also be applied to very simple systems that are not ordinarily regarded as conscious. On the other hand, if a theory is more strict and focuses more on what is going on in the human case, and thereby provides sufficient criteria for the description of consciousness, then it's harder to apply this theory to the non-human case. So this actually constitutes what one could call a double bind problem for theories of consciousness, and it consists in providing sufficient criteria for the description of consciousness that are applicable to non-human systems. So providing sufficient criteria is easier if you have very strict criteria, and if you orient yourself, or if you look at the human case and see, well, what's going on here. But if you have such strict criteria that are more focused on human beings, then it seems they are not applicable to non-human systems. And on the other hand, if you're too liberal, then it seems you're not providing sufficient criteria anymore. Okay, so this is a problem that I guess can also be solved. So I wouldn't reject this strategy of assessing existing theories. I think it's highly valuable, but it suggests that it would be worthwhile to consider alternatives as well. And one alternative would be integration. So here the idea is that we don't really have to choose between all of these theories of consciousness. We can actually combine some of them. They may mutually support each other. And a recent example is this paper by Michael Graziano and colleagues, in which they suggest that actually the attention schema theory, AST, can be combined with global workspace theory and higher order thought theory. And so here's how the authors describe this. In attention schema theory, the brain contains attention, which boosts signals ultimately into a global workspace. And in addition, the brain also constructs a higher order representation of that global workspace. So there's both the global workspace idea and the higher order idea. And the higher order representation, in this case, is a representation of the dynamics and consequences of having a global workspace. And according to the authors, attention schema theory is literally the simplest possible way to unify HOT and GW, and that it posits a higher order representation of the global workspace. So the idea is that attention schema theory is actually the conjunction or combination of HOT and global workspace theory. But there's some problems with this specific particular proposal. So it seems that AST misconstrues HOT. At least that's what David Rosenthal has recently argued in a commentary on this paper. And also the truth of attention schema theory, if it's really a combination of these theories, is contingent on the truth of these theories. So if there's a problem with HOT or GWT, then there's also a problem with attention schema theory. And arguably both HOT and global workspace theory face a double bind problem. So it's not, they don't seem to cope with both of the two arguments that have been proposed in the paper I just referred to. And so this suggests maybe looking for an alternative. Of course, one could argue, well, this is not a problem in principle for this approach. It's just a problem for this particular proposal, and I'm fine with that. So I I don't think it's a bad idea to try and combine existing theories, but it's worthwhile to look at other approaches. And here the general idea would be to replace existing theories with something simpler. One would be a list of jointly sufficient conditions for the description of consciousness. So these would be markers of consciousness. And the other approach would be to provide a list of merely necessary conditions. And here one could ask, well, why should one do any of this? And so here's one example by Eva Ginsberg and Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka. And in their recent book, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, they argue that there's, on the one hand, much disagreement over which conditions are necessary for consciousness, but they suggest that there's a hidden consensus in consciousness research, because there's a list of jointly sufficient conditions for consciousness in biological organisms under the actual laws of nature that is relatively uncontroversial. So even researchers who disagree or have different theories of consciousness that they favor, they would agree still there's a list of sufficient conditions. And the main disagreement, according to the authors, is on which of these conditions is also necessary for consciousness. And this is the list taken from a paper the two authors have recently published with Jonathan Birch. And it includes global accessibility and broadcast, binding, unification, selective attention and inclusion, intentionality, and so on. And I think what is striking here is that most of these conditions or features that are mentioned on this list are just features that characterize structured consciousness, what I mentioned in the beginning. So it's very plausible to assume that, yeah, these are actually sufficient conditions for structured consciousness. Okay, but what to do with this? So the next question the authors ask then is, can we find a property that requires all the above hallmarks of consciousness, these sufficient conditions, yet is possessed by a wide range of non-human animals? A property that is, so to speak, as simple as possible, but not simpler. And if you find such a property that is not only possessed by human beings, but can also be found in non-human animals, then this would mean we could make progress on the question which animals, non-human animals, are conscious, and so on. And the authors suggest that unlimited associative learning is such a property that is widespread and can serve as a marker for consciousness. So UAL, unlimited associative learning, is a capacity for associative learning on novel compound stimuli with the potential for second-order conditioning and trace conditioning, allowing for the open-ended accumulation of long chains of associative links during an animal's lifetime. It includes the ability to bridge temporal gaps, to learn about conditional stimuli that are no longer present, and it is posited to be a natural cluster, a cluster of enhanced learning abilities that are closely linked. So they would suggest there's a single mechanism that accounts for these different abilities. And here's then the entire picture. ULL is proposed as a transition marker for consciousness, and UAL requires these different properties, cluster of properties or conditions that are sufficient for consciousness. And so if UAL requires these features, then it means that it is sufficient for them. And if these features are sufficient for consciousness, then it seems that UAL is sufficient for consciousness, so, and is a marker of consciousness. That doesn't mean that it's necessary, only that it's sufficient. So there might be consciousness in systems that are not capable of unlimited associative learning. But the idea is just, if you find an animal that has this ability, then this provides a good reason to think it's conscious. Now, I think this is extremely interesting and promising. There's maybe one potential problem And it's this arrow here. So they argue that UAL requires these features. And it can be a bit difficult to evaluate this claim because some of these notions, global accessibility and broadcast, are a bit vague, for instance. And so it can be difficult to really to assess this claim and argue for it in more detail. And this is why perhaps an even simpler approach should also be considered. And the point that the notion of global accessibility and broadcast is not that clear, at least when it comes to non-human beings. This point has been made by Jonathan Birch in a recent paper. So he asked in this paper how to apply theories such as global workspace theory to non-human animals. And this, of course, depends on how one interprets the theory. A cautious interpretation would be that GWT yields sufficient conditions or sufficient condition for consciousness in human beings only, but then it's not applicable to non-human animals. And an ambitious interpretation would be that it provides sufficient conditions in any context. But then the problem is, what does global broadcasting mean in non-human systems? So how do we know what kind of global broadcasting is sufficient for consciousness in non-human animals? Because to construct such an account, we would first need a clear picture of which non-human animals and brain-damaged humans are conscious and which are not. And this is precisely the issue we were hoping the theory could settle. Okay, so just applying an existing theory to the non-human case will not work, at least not for all non-human animals. And the general diagnosis that Birch makes is that strong sufficient conditions for consciousness will not get us very far in making inferences about cases other than humans who can report their experiences, if they get us anywhere. Yet as we formulate increasingly weaker conditions, the evidence from humans that they amount to a sufficient condition becomes weaker, and the positive case for animal consciousness becomes correspondingly weaker. So this again points to what I call the double bind problem. If you have very strong conditions for consciousness, then it's hard to apply them to non-human animals. And if you have more liberal conditions, then it's doubtful that they're really sufficient for consciousness. Okay, so as an alternative, Birch proposes what he calls the theory-light approach. And this is based on the facilitation hypothesis, according to which phenomenally conscious perception of a stimulus facilitates, relative to unconscious perception, a cluster of cognitive abilities in relation to that stimulus. So this reminds us of the approach by Ginsberg and Jablonka. So what cognitive abilities is Birch thinking of? So he mentions three candidates: trace conditioning, which involves learning associations between temporally distinct stimuli; rapid reversal learning, learning reversed relationships between stimuli; and cross-modal learning, learning associations between stimuli in different sensory modalities. And one could ask, why does it have to be a cluster of abilities? And the answer is, if we have only one such ability and find that one ability in the target non-human species, a critic will say that could be done without consciousness, even if it happens to involve consciousness in humans. So we need a cluster of correlated abilities, not just one, in order to build up a case that is harder for the critic to resist. So the idea would be there's a single mechanism, phenomenal consciousness, that facilitates these abilities, makes them easier or boosts them, or maybe even enables some of these abilities in the first place. There's another very interesting proposal by Henry Shevlin that has recently been published, which I will skip, I guess. So maybe if you just take a look at the bottom part of the slide. And so he suggests that that it would be possible to combine a theory-light approach with a theory-heavy approach. So we start with a list of markers of consciousness, this cluster of cognitive abilities, and then there will be some easy cases, some non-human animals that clearly have these abilities, and others that for which it's more difficult because maybe they have only some of the abilities of this cluster, but not all of them, and then it's unclear whether we should ascribe consciousness to them or not. And Shevlin suggests that then we can look at the strong candidates and see, for instance, in what sense they have a global workspace. And if we see, okay, they have a global workspace mechanism with features C1, C2, and so on, then we can go back to the weak candidates, the controversial cases, and determine whether they have a global workspace mechanism with the same features. And if they do, then that provides further evidence for consciousness in these more controversial cases. Okay, but I will now turn to something slightly different, namely a paper recently published by Ryota Kanai and colleagues, in which they suggest that we shouldn't just look for a cluster of cognitive abilities associated with consciousness, but also try to find out whether there's a common mechanism that enables these cognitive functions. So, and the functions of consciousness that the authors think of include a non-reflexive behavior, trace conditioning, delayed response, counterfactual predictions for intention and planning. And as you can see, there's already at least an overlap between this list and the clusters that were mentioned, that are mentioned by Birch, for instance. And so as such, this is still just a list of markers of consciousness or candidates for markers of consciousness. And the interesting further question that the authors ask now is there a computational mechanism that is common across a variety of non-reflexive behavior? So is there some mechanism that is central to understanding these different functions of consciousness, or that enables all of them? And the authors propose that, in fact, there is such a mechanism, and they call it information generation. So what is information generation? It's the ability to internally generate sensory representations that are not direct reflections of the current sensory input. And if you think about it, this is actually extremely common in conscious experience. So you probably all know this image here. So you not only see black dots on a white background, but if you know this picture, or if you know that there's a dog, a Dalmatian, you see the Dalmatian over here. And this is something that is in a way additional to the sensory information that is currently present. So there's some information generated in constructing and in creating the percept. Similarly, I mean, there are many other examples I could give. Here you're not only seeing the pie-shaped stimuli, the pie-shaped forms, but also, in addition, the triangle, which is not strictly given in the sensory input. Here you're not just perceiving moving points, but a moving figure, point-like walker. And this also fits nicely to predictive processing or active inference accounts of perception, according to which perception and action involve inferences. So the idea is that the brain only has direct access to the sensory signals, which are effects of hidden causes, and based on an internal model, the brain tries to find out what the hidden causes are of sensory signals. So it's as if the brain was only looking at a shadow and trying to determine what the source or origin of the shadow was. So in this case, what could be the hidden cause of the shadow? It could be a wolf or something else. And if you know this example, you know it's a cat. And yeah, it's so if you're inferring that this is there's a cat, you have to go beyond the information that is contained in the shadow. So you have to generate information, and the idea is that the brain has this information that it's embodied in its internal model. And when predictions of sensory signals are generated, when percepts are generated, then this additional information is used to construct the percept. Okay, so information generation is the ability to internally generate sensory representations that are not direct reflections of the current sensory input, and the ability to generate possibly counterfactual representations using internal models learned through interactions with the environment is, according to the authors, the function of consciousness. It allows an agent to engage with possibly counterfactual states not happening at the present moment. And it enables an agent to detach itself from the environment and perform non-reflexive behavior, such as planning future actions through mental simulations of the environment. And this, again, dovetails really nicely with ideas from predictive processing. So here's a statement from Andy Clark, in which he says, well, systems that have a particular way of perceiving things, namely in the way in which, in the way suggested by predictive processing, systems that know how to perceive an object as a cat are, according to predictive processing, systems that ipso facto are able to bring about the kinds of activity pattern that would be characteristic of the presence of a cat. So systems that are able to perceive a cat in the way that human beings do it are also able to imagine a cat or to dream of a cat, and so on. And here's another example of what information generation is. The authors mention the variational autoencoder, which consists of an encoder and a decoder. So the encoder processes sensory information and compresses it, and the decoder decompresses these compressed representations. And so this involves mapping from an abstract low-dimensional representation to a high-dimensional representation in the data space. But it's very important to point out that this is not mere decompression, because in mere decompression, there's no additional information. It's just a more redundant representation. But that's not what is meant here. So it's not like decompressing a zip file. The decompressed zip file does not really contain more information than the compressed file, because, well, you can just decompress the zip file and then have the content that is in the decompressed, in the original file. So what's the difference? Take a look at this animation. There are some dots moving apparently randomly, but if you know this or now continue watching, you see that there actually is a pattern in the trajectories of the points. Actually, there's not only one pattern, but there are at least three patterns that can be extracted. And yeah, it's a really nice animation. And so I've taken this animation from the website of Danny Borsboom, but apparently he's not the one who created the animation. So if anyone knows who created this animation, perhaps you can tell us in the discussion. Okay, so why did I show you this example? So let's return to this idea that the brain infers the hidden causes of sensory signals. And let's say there are some objects with a certain shape. These are the hidden causes of sensory signals. Sensory signals are these points that move in a certain way, and the brain tries to infer the hidden structure, statistical regularities in these trajectories. And it does that using an internal model. So this would be a compressed, idealized representation of the sensory signals, but which contains information about these points, about statistical regularities in the way these points move, if it is assumed that these triangles rotate. And when the brain predicts sensory signals based on this internal representation, the idea is that it decompresses this representation in a way that that generates information. And there's another way to look at this, which might first seem a bit confusing. So Giulio Ruffini has suggested that sensory predictions, that they seemingly have high complexity in the sense of Lempel-Ziff or Lempel-Ziff-Welch complexity, but low Kolmogorov complexity. And let me briefly explain what this means. So Kolmogorov complexity or algorithmic complexity of a string is just the length of the shortest program producing that string. Lempel-Ziff complexity is, by contrast, a measure of compressibility, and this also constitutes the basis for compression algorithms that are, for instance, used to create a zip file. And interestingly, it also constitutes the basis for at least many complexity measures that are used in consciousness research. So, as you may know, there's research associating complexity with consciousness, and many of these measures are based on Lempel-Ziff complexity. And now we can compare these two measures. An infinite string produced by a pseudo-random number generator would have low Kolmogorov complexity, high Lempel-Ziff complexity. A Martin-Löw random string is, by definition, a string that has high Kolmogorov complexity, and it also has high Lempel-Ziff complexity. And then there's a string encoding a trajectory on a strange attractor would have low Kolmogorov complexity, but high Lempel-Ziff complexity, and a string encoding a strange attractor would have high complexities in both senses. And what this just illustrates is that even strings with low Kolmogorov complexity can have high Lempel-Ziff complexity. This can be now used to further explain what the difference is between just decompressing without generating information and decompressing with generating information. So the idea would be that an uncompressed file does not have high Lempel-Ziff complexity. And that's why decompressing a zip file does not generate information. By contrast, the idea would be that conscious neural activity involves decompressing with generating information, because the results, for instance, predictions of sensory signals, will have high Lempel-Ziff complexity, or neural responses to sensory signals will have high Lempel-Ziff complexity. That's why it can be also used as a proxy for consciousness by empirical measures of consciousness. And the idea is that it involves that these neural responses are created from more from simpler representations that are then decompressed, but in a way that generates information, that is, that creates a representation with high Lempel-Ziff complexity. Okay, so this only suggests that information generation is necessary for consciousness, but is it also sufficient? That's in fact what the authors suggest. But I mean, so far they've first they only argue that functions of consciousness are sufficient for consciousness because they require consciousness. So consciousness is necessary for these functions of consciousness. There are certain cognitive abilities that cannot be had without conscious processing. And the idea would then be that if you have these abilities, then you also have consciousness. Then we can ask, well, what about information generation? So it's very plausible that information generation is necessary for these functions of consciousness. Conversely, that functions of consciousness are sufficient for information generation, but that doesn't mean that information generation is sufficient for consciousness, right? So it could be that information generation, that there are many systems that are capable of generating information without being conscious or without having these cognitive abilities. So this is something that I argue for in my recent Neuroscience of Consciousness paper. And there I suggests that information generation should rather be seen as a minimal unifying model, so not as a theory of consciousness or as a sufficient condition for consciousness, but as a minimal unifying model, or MUM. And what do I mean by that? A MUM specifies only necessary conditions for consciousness, involves determinable descriptions that can be made more specific, and unifies existing accounts of consciousness. So empirically, a MUM is minimal by specifying properties that most states of consciousness have in common. It specifies only necessary features of conscious experiences. Conceptually, it is minimal by offering a determinable characterization. And furthermore, a MUM is unifying to the extent that it highlights assumptions that existing approaches have in common. And so what do I mean by determinable property? An example of a determinable would be color. And color can be determined in different ways, or can be different determinants of color. Blue and red would be examples, but you can then be more specific, and a cyan would be a determinate of the determinable blue, and blue would be a determinant of the determinable color. So it's just a very general relation between properties. And the idea would be that information generation is also such a determinable property, and predictive processing would be a slightly more specific determinable of information generation. That is a more specific type of information generation, and this can be specified in further ways. So predictive processing in temporally deep models would be another determinable. And in principle, we can continue this process of finding more specific ways of information generation. And the idea would be that in the end, you find a determinable of information generation that is sufficient for consciousness, or that is consciousness. So you start with a merely necessary condition for consciousness, information generation. And if you make it more specific, in the end, you get a sufficient condition for consciousness. So this can, in fact, be related to Birch's facilitation hypothesis. So recall that the idea is that phenomenally conscious perception of a stimulus facilitates, relative to unconscious perception, a cluster of cognitive abilities in relation to that stimulus. And this hypothesis can be corroborated by empirical evidence. So you can look at cases of non-human animals. Is it really the case that animals that have one of these abilities also have the others, and so on? So there are certain predictions that can be derived and tested, but there can also be a theoretical support for this. For instance, if a minimal model of one cognitive ability in this cluster also is a minimal model of other abilities. And a hypothetical example would be that predictive processing models of this cluster of abilities all require deep temporal processing. So there's a general computational property that all these that models of these different abilities all involve. And so in this way, in principle, there could be a theoretical support for the facilitation hypothesis. And in a way, I think the free energy principle, or active inference, can be regarded as the ultimate minimal unifying model. So because FEP and active inference, they involve information generation. There are models of cognitive abilities. It can be related to computational correlates of consciousness and complexity measures, and also to theories of consciousness. So for instance, recently, Chris Wright and Ryan Smith have proposed an active inference version of global workspace theory, which seeks to deal with certain problems and also make certain claims of the theory more specific. So in the end, active inference, or the free energy principle, could serve as a more general framework that encompasses and involves unification, but also subsumes the other two strategies that I mentioned, because it can be used to improve existing theories or combine existing theories, and in that way subsume both of these strategies: assess and adapt and integration. But I'm aware that not everyone is convinced that active inference is a good thing. So I mean, if there are any other theoretical approaches that can be related to these different lines of research and unifying them in a way, I think that would be great, and is something that should be investigated. Okay, let me wrap this up. I've briefly explained and illustrated 3 different theoretical approaches to advancing the science of consciousness, particularly for making progress on theories of consciousness. And my main claim was that theoretical approaches should focus on unification, because ideally it subsumes the other 2 approaches. So thank you for your attention.